What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the BLU View 3 about a year after my original review and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy at this point. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU View 3, we're getting a 6-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 268, and an 18:9 aspect ratio. Now on one hand, it's not really terrible, but if you're really going to be consuming a lot of content, I feel like you might want something a bit larger. Now a case could be made for a smaller display being a bit more compact, but with the BLU View 3, this isn't really the case because as you can see, the bottom bezel and the top bezel are quite a bit thicker, making the phone as a whole around the same general size as something that has a much larger display. So yeah, these bezels are definitely a waste of space, and considering that in 2023 this design is pretty outdated, I'm not really a huge fan here. But at least when it comes to the image quality, despite the display not really being very bright, the 720p resolution looks okay and the colors are decent, so maybe you're not really consuming a ton of content, but you just want to watch the occasional video every now and then or browse social media real quick or something like that, it will at least get the job done. But if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, then yeah, especially with the options out now, it does leave a bit to be desired. Now for storage, with the BLU View 3, we're getting 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and while I wish I could say 32GB is pretty outdated at this point, unfortunately even now in 2023, there are plenty of new phones that still only have this amount of storage. Do I think it's going to be enough for most people? No. But in this price range, with this really entry-level kind of tier, unfortunately, it is pretty common, and at least we are getting microSD card expansion here. So if you have a lot of photos and videos and music and stuff like that, you can always put stuff onto a microSD card and that will help a bit. But if you have a lot of apps and games and stuff like that, overall I feel like 32GB for the average user is just not going to be enough. So unless you're more of a light user, storage might be an issue here. Now in case you're wondering, to get to the microSD card slot, what you're going to do is pop off this tab right here. So like this. If I can actually get it off. There we go. Then the back comes off, revealing a not so removable battery. I don't know why they did this. I feel like if you're gonna make the back removable, you might as well make the battery removable too, but as you can see, it's like screwed in, so don't try to take this out. It's probably gonna completely ruin the phone. But as you can see up top, the slot for the SIM card is right here, and the microSD card slot is right here. Now for security features, with the BLU View 3, unfortunately this phone has neither a fingerprint scanner nor face unlock, so to unlock it, you will have to use a pin. Now, I personally just don't even have any screen lock. I only use this phone for these videos, so I have no reason to, but if you are using your phone in general, you're probably going to want at least a pin, if not like a password or maybe a pattern if you don't want to go through too much trouble to unlock it. But in general, I feel like it is pretty disappointing that at this point in 2023, there are still phones out there that don't have a fingerprint scanner or face unlock. I know there are phones like iPhones, for example, that don't have fingerprint scanners, which is kind of weird considering it's a $1,000 phone. And then the Google Pixel 6a I don't think has face unlock, but it does have a fingerprint scanner, so getting both isn't really necessary. But at the same time, not having either is definitely a drawback even in phones like this, because I've seen phones you can typically get for $30 to $50 that still have at least face unlock, and surprisingly, unlike the TCL 30Z for example, which is pretty much around the same level as this, the face unlock does work pretty well. So I know it's a feature they could implement, but unfortunately it's not there. So if that does bother you, definitely keep this in mind. Now taking a look at the camera setup here with the BLU View 3, up front, we got the front facing camera right here on the bezel. This camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a single camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. Now, in general, I can imagine most people getting a phone like this are not going to be getting it from mobile photography or anything like that, so you're probably not expecting amazing photo quality. But keep in mind, it's definitely not the best if you're really going to be taking a lot of pictures, because in addition to not having the best quality, which we'll get to, the BLU View 3 also doesn't have a ton of features. Sure, it has your basic camera and it can technically record videos, but aside from that, there's no ultra wide camera, no macro camera, not even a depth sensing camera, although I will say portrait mode is at least functional, so it's not too bad. But when it comes to overall photo quality, for what it is, it's actually surprisingly decent. Now, on one hand, if you're taking a lot of pictures and you really want amazing quality, there are countless other phones I can name that are much better than this, for really not that much more price-wise. But at the same time, if you're not really that concerned about the camera, but you do want to get some decently nice photos every now and then, it will get get the job done. To give you an idea of what they can do, here's some pictures taken with the BLU 3. And again, I do think for what it is, maybe not just objectively, they're not like amazing photos or anything, but considering this is a really entry-level phone, I mean, one of the cheapest phones you can get for that matter, the photo quality is actually pretty acceptable. I mean, I've seen more expensive phones that have much worse cameras. So in general, if you don't really care that much about the camera, but you want something at least usable for things other than barcode scanning, the BLU 3 will actually be pretty decent. And again, remember, if you're taking a lot of pictures, even though this phone has hardly any internal storage, you can put photos and videos onto a microSD card, so definitely keep that in mind too. And speaking of videos, the BLU 3 can record 1080p videos in the rear camera, but only 720p in the front. So with this phone, you're not going to be recording any YouTube quality videos or anything like that, but just keep in mind, for something like Snapchat for example, where the quality just doesn't really matter, it will at least get the job done. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the BLU 3, we're getting 3GB of RAM with a MediaTek Helio P22 processor. Now, overall, despite everything, the performance we're getting with this phone is actually pretty good. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not crazy fast or anything. This is, after all, a really entry-level device, but at the same time, I personally haven't had any performance issues. It's not really laggy, it doesn't crash, nothing like that. It does have some slightly long load times depending on what you're doing, but honestly, compared to the average phone in this price range, the BLU 3 is actually one of the faster options. And again, keep in mind, if you're more of a heavy user, especially if you're doing a lot of mobile gaming, for example, this phone doesn't have a lot of RAM and it's definitely not fast. So if you are more of a heavy user, you will want to get something quite a bit faster than this. But for stuff like light web browsing, some social media use here and there, and watching a couple videos every now and then, it will still get the job done. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5. And here are the results I got. Now what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance wise compared to your current device, because depending on what you have, this may or may not actually be an upgrade, or it could be a huge downgrade. It really just depends. But again, in general, if you're looking for something for really basic activities, it will at least get the job done, and I feel like for most people in that kind of situation, you're most likely not going to have any issues. For the battery, I will say it's definitely not the best. With the BLU 3, we are getting a 3400 mAh battery, and as far as I know, it doesn't have any fast charging, which, considering what it is, I'm not really that surprised. But keep in mind, a 3400 mAh battery is really not great. Now, to be fair, in my experience, the battery life on this phone is not terrible, and if you're not using it all day, the battery life will be at least decent. But if you are in a situation where you really need a great battery, this is definitely not going to be the phone for you, because again, a 3400 mAh battery, while not being the absolute worst, is definitely far from the best. And there are plenty of phones even around this price range, not really a whole lot more, that have 5000 mAh batteries, or at least something close to it. So you really can do better here. And again, even though it kind of looks like it, the battery on this phone is not removable, so definitely don't try to take it out. Now for the software, the BLU 3 is honestly pretty outdated. This phone does currently have Android 11, which is on the older side considering we are in Android 13 at this point. So yeah, if you do want a newer software, then you're definitely not going to want this phone. And it is really too bad considering you can get something like a Samsung Galaxy A03s, for example, that does have Android 13 and it's pretty much around the same range as this phone. But in general, I'm not too surprised because when it comes to BLU really just doesn't have good software support. But at the end of the day, I feel like if you're not really that worried about software, it is at least okay. I mean, I haven't had any performance issues because of it, and if you're getting a really affordable phone for more basic activities, you might not really need the latest software anyway. So if that is the case, if you're really just looking for more or less a phone for pretty much the bare minimum, and software just really isn't a concern for you, then this might not be a big deal. Also keep in mind, unfortunately, the BLU 3 doesn't have NFC, which again is just really not surprising considering this is a really entry-level phone. And honestly, when I really think about it, there are maybe like 2 phones around this general price range that do have NFC, and they're both Cricket phones, so overall, not a super common feature in entry-level phones anyway. But if you are hoping to use tap and pay, you might be disappointed here. But in conclusion, my overall thoughts about the BLU 3 about a year after my original review. In general, I do want to say it's not a terrible phone. Sure, it's missing a lot of features people typically find in almost any smartphone nowadays, like, again, for example, the Samsung Galaxy A03s is around the same general range, and so is something like the Motorola Moto G Play 2023, and both of those phones have much better displays, better cameras, better batteries, and the performance is roughly the same level. But at the same time, not everyone is really looking for an amazing display, a super good camera, or an enormous battery, or even the latest software. And if you're really looking for something for the bare minimum, in general, this phone is really affordable, and while some carriers have some pretty good deals nowadays, keep in mind this phone is typically only offered through TracFone or Straight Talk. And with these carriers, you're probably not going to get a crazy deal where you can get a Samsung Galaxy A14 5G for free. So in that kind of situation where you don't really need something that has a ton of features or crazy good performance or really a whole lot of anything, and you just need something to use as a phone for not much more than the bare minimum, in that kind of situation, despite everything, I do think the BLU 3 being such an affordable device is definitely at least worth considering. But this concludes my 1-year review of the BLU 3. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalibus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.